Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to everyone that is tuning in, inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah, al-Wahid al-Ahad, alladhi la ilaha illahu, wa afdalu salati wa atammu taslim. Ala Sayyid al-Wujud, alladhi khuliqa bin nurihi kullu mawjud, wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Welcome everybody, inshallah, to Taqleen, Open Madrasa's open conversation. And we are very, very excited today, very honored to have with us our teacher, our beloved Shaykh Hasan Spiker, currently from Amman in Jordan. And he's been very, very kind to give his time. And we're very humbled to have him. I think I speak for a lot of people when I say that he's been a noble teacher and a guide in many, many aspects and areas for all of us. And so he's been very kind to come on today. I was going to formally introduce him, but I think that would be su'ul adab and bad manners towards Shaykh Hasan, because I think everybody knows him. But I think if I could just in a few words say how I feel about Shaykh Hasan, I think that there's very few people that can articulate the Islamic intellectual, spiritual tradition in the English language. And I think Shaykh Hasan is at the top of that. So I think for a lot of people, we've benefited immensely because he's someone that not only has studied, or his education in the Western Academy has been celebrated, but it's really what he took from his mashayikh. I think it's the many, many years, beyond a decade of study at the feet of extremely noble ulama who have sacred lineages, not just in terms of their blood, but in terms of their ilm, in terms of their understanding, in terms of their spirituality. And again, there's no mubalagha, there's no and sort of hyperbole in what I'm saying. This is just a matter of fact. And so he dedicated his life to the pursuit of knowledge and understanding, and taking it directly from those sources from whom really knowledge should be taken. And so I think that is, subhanallah, a rare opportunity, inshallah, for all of us to be able to hear him speak. And I think for me today, to be able to pose questions and to ask him things and to pick his brain, and inshallah, to take as much as we can in this short time that we have together. So inshallah, with that introduction done, Shaykh Hasan, ahlan wa sahlan, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Maulana. The honor is all mine. And I'd just like to say to everyone that, for me, it's a total honor and a huge opportunity to sit at the feet of Shaykh Shams Tameez for a couple of hours and to clarify in my head a lot of questions that I have. So that's my near in having this conversation. Shaykh Shams really is an inheritor of an extraordinary scholarly and spiritual lineage. And so, it's all the more of an honor for me to have this opportunity. And thank you for your kind words, which are all entirely untrue. But anyway, alhamdulillah. Have to put up with it.
I think with your permission, what we'll do, I mean, the viewers and the listeners, unfortunate for them, we had our conversation before this. So a lot of short fire or, interesting conversations about Shaykh Hasan. We've already done that, and that was just for me. So I thank Shaykh Hasan for that. But for everybody else, it's going to be getting straight into the topic today. So we actually titled this "Where the Soul Once Wandered," and the reason why was because I think we're in maybe even past postmodernity and the type of metamodernism that we're in now, where there is this somewhat realization of people that they want something that they once probably had as human beings. There's a sort of the soul is a little bit uncomfortable. So they like their modernity, they like their materialism, they like their creature comforts, but there's an element of, is this it? And apparently everything stopped with Hegel. So there's nothing beyond this for us now. So what is there? And so I think there is this, and you've been really crucial in that, because with your books, Nasr al-Amr, Hierarchy and Freedom, and all of the wonderful things that you've written and spoken about in your classes, it's been amazing, because it's been an eye-opener for so many people that probably didn't have access to the Islamic tradition because they didn't have access to Arabic, or they weren't able to travel, they weren't able to study. So for that reason, we want to talk about philosophy, but from this perspective. So some people talk about philosophical Sufism, or it doesn't really matter. The names are not important. So we want to get into where the soul wandered. But it is a type of philosophy. That's what we can name it. So I think from that perspective, when people hear the word philosophy, they think maybe it's a Western thing. If I was to just ask you, what is philosophy for Muslims? What has it been for traditional Orthodox Muslims? What has falsafa meant to them?
Well, it's meant بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا مولانا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. Well, philosophy has meant so many different things to different Muslims. I'd like to go back to what a Shaykh al-Akbar says in Al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah when he mentions Plato, who is the only philosopher that he mentions in the entire Futuhat al-Makkiyah, by the way. He mentions Plato by name, and he talks about Aflatun al-Ilahi, which means the metaphysician. And he says that Aflatun al-Ilahi was one of the very few philosophers whose fundamental method was dhawq, was experiential knowledge, experiential vision. That was his fundamental, his main source of knowledge, I should say, was dhawq. Because Al-Shaykh al-Akbar has just said there is nothing that it's not possible to know through direct experience, right? Through direct kashf. And if the philosophers have ever used these methods, those philosophers are very, very rare, but foremost amongst them is Aflatun al-Ilahi. And he says the people of Islam have only, if they've ever directed enmity towards him, it's only because of their ignorance of the denotation of the word philosophy. And he then gives the etymology right there in the Futuhat of the word philosophy, which of course means love of wisdom, right? And so, Sheikh al-Akbar is obviously making a point there, as he always is, making a very, very profound tahqiqi point, which is that yani, there is an inner core, there's a fundamental original meaning to philosophy, which is contained there in its etymology, which is obviously beyond reproach. It's obviously called for, the love of wisdom is something which is called for 100% wholeheartedly by the revelation in from every possible in every possible way of looking at this. We are an ummah of the love of wisdom, right? And so, yani, if philosophy is taken back to its original etymological sense, which is seeking after truth, I mean, that's what informs wujub and nazar, you know. Fundamentally, as human beings, we desire to know. We have a love for wisdom. We want to find out the truth. We long in our fitrah for goodness, truth, and beauty. It's that we possess this natural inclination to want to seek after the truth and know the truth and accept the truth. And so that is the original impetus behind philosophy. Now, of course, then philosophy becomes a particular formalized discipline, and then it has many different iterations, which you could sum up in saying that it studies حقائق الأشياء, right? على ما هي عليها بقدر الطاقة البشرية, right? And then when you zoom into specific applications of philosophy, you'd be talking about al-mawjud bima huwa mawjud. You'd be talking about, علم ما بعد الطبيعة. You'd be talking about الفلسفة الأولى, or you'd be talking about the specifically ethical akhlaq tradition. And then, of course, you have what we today call the natural sciences are also subordinated to metaphysics, and they're considered to be part of philosophy as this broad discipline. Part of theoretical philosophy would be physics and mathematics, and this is something which is really across the board from the time of Plato and Aristotle onwards, and then branching into the Islamic world, and then branching into the Christian world as well, for example. But what I find most interesting is that if you look at the way that Sayyid al-Sharif al-Jurjani, Quddasa Sirru, defines philosophy in his Tarifat, it is identical to the Neoplatonic, as it were, more or less, as close as it gets to official definition. Not there is such a thing, but as close as it gets to an official definition of philosophy amongst the Neoplatonists, close as it gets to an ijma', right? And so, this Neoplatonic definition comes from two different places in the Platonic dialogues. And what it fundamentally says is that philosophy is homoiosis theo. It is becoming an image of the divine. By distancing ourselves from the body as much as possible through a process of catharsis, which obviously in the modern English language means something kind of a bit sentimental and psychological, but catharsis originally means purification. So by a process of purification. And so if you go up and look you go and look that up in the Tarifat, al-Hikmah, you will find that he says that it is al-takhalluq bi-akhlaq Allah ala qadr taqat al-bashariyah, and then in terms of a process of purification, tazkiyat an-nafs, or something very close to that. I don't know the original quotation verbatim, but that is so there's obviously a continuous tradition which is a deeper understanding of what philosophy entails. And what this basically amounts to ultimately is the distinction between two very different methodological approaches. I think one of the real shortcomings and one of the real narrownesses, which is unfortunate and very much not suited to the challenges of the time, which has afflicted our orientation as Muslims, basically, who have been knocked on the head, had amnesia, by colonialism, by the dismantling of our traditional systems. We've now woken up and we want to find an Islamic identity. So, we're all badge wearing, flag waving Asharis or Maturides or Atharis, whatever that's supposed to be. Never used to exist 15 years ago, but an Athari is apparently now a thing. We're all badge wearing subcultures. And I understand that. And, I've been through that myself. And it's in a way laudable because it's very good for us to want to recover an Islamic identity. But the thing is, what we're playing into is this kind of a modernist marketplace of ideas, and I call it modernist because it's thriving in terms of assumptions from ideological nominalism, which is not based on the correspondence theory of truth, where we're trying to actually use the tools at our disposal to get at the truth, which is really there, available to us if only we can become qualified. But it's rather a constructionist account of truth, which is I'm going to identify in this way because it suits me, and so that also leads to a lot of su'al adab, because rather than looking at your philosophical interlocutor or theological interlocutor as someone who is also trying to get at the truth, but might have just gone, from your perspective, wrong a little bit here or a little bit here. It's just, it's my identity is tied to my ego, and these people are the people to laugh at. These people who we don't respect, who've got it completely wrong. And the thing is, that's not the way that we look at. That's not, if you go back, and this is what we were saying before we went live here, is that it's obviously a very, very difficult time if you're a teenager at this time to grow up and see the rancor that exists in the public discourse when it comes to the various factions who are trying to take baby steps to revive the deen, and most often think that they're taking most often are rather too big for their boots and don't even realize that they're taking baby steps at best. They probably think they're doing tajdeed or something silly like that. But hasha tajdeed, but you know what I mean in terms of their false conception of it. But there are two broad conceptions of philosophy in the traditional Islamic world. Again, we're very blinkered when we say philosophy today. If we're rejecting it or trying to find out what the hukm shari of it is, we say, what's the hukm of falsafa? What do we mean by falsafa? Do we mean philosophy in this broadest possible sense, going back to the love of wisdom? No, we basically just mean Ibn Sina. Okay. when they say al-hukama or the falasifa in our books, okay, they mostly mean Ibn Sina when you actually go and look at the content of what they're referring to. There are exceptions, many, many exceptions, but the thing is we're very blinkered, so we tend to not follow that alternative tradition. And it's not that it's alternative in the sense that it's somehow less fundamental or it's somehow diverging from what is most widely accepted by scholars. It's alternative just because we're so blinkered. We think that, a kind of a conception of Islamic intellectual history, which is informed by two main things: Orientalists and an ulama class who have lost the aqliyat in most cases. And I think this is one of the difficult truths that we're going to have to face up to, and many ulama do. Okay, so we have a false, very narrow conception of what the tradition is. If you go to books by, our great scholars from the Indian subcontinent in, the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, their conception of what aqliyat involves is so much broader, so much wider. In much of the Ottoman tradition, it's so much wider. So, you have two broad methodologies in seeking after haqa'iq al-ashya. One is the broad Masha'i methodology, and one is the broad Ishraqi methodology. Okay. Again, a lot of people today, when you say the Ishraqi methodology, because with all due respect, they took one or two very simple little baby steps books in aqliyat from their great scholars, and then they'll very wisely tell you, our teachers told us that, everything's very, very, very narrow. But okay, who are your teachers and who are you? Those are the questions that we have to bear in mind here. I'm all for adab. I'm all for, because this is absolutely integral to the knowledge process, the knowledge acquisition process. Adab is indispensable. However, if we're in a situation where we are revering in the traditional manner a tradition which has disappeared, as in we're revering remnants and snapshots and leftovers, baqaya of a great tradition that has lost most of its content, then are we really revering the deen, or are we just revering the latest graduate of whatever alamiya thing that we consider ourselves to ascribe ourselves, we consider ourselves to be affiliated to. So, we'll have noticed I haven't mentioned any names, any particularities, but it's a general problem. And there are many exceptions, okay? But they will very often reject out of hand any talk of an Ishraqi mashrab. In your experience, Sheikh Shams, with the Khairabadi tradition, the Farangi Mahal tradition, there's no such thing as the Ishraqi mashrab?
Of course, absolutely, Sayyidi. I think you know that very, very well.
Well, that's why I'm asking you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
of course. The Farangi Mahal is very clear and explicit in their not only their subscription but their deep devotion to Shaykh al-Akbar in particular. And I always give the example of Bahrul Ulum because he's the son of, you know, so these are the founding fathers of your Dars and Islamic curriculum. And for him, Shaykh al-Akbar, in fact, I always give the example that, like when you have a book, there's a commentary on a book, and they'll say Alhamd, and they'll say, oh, Qala Ibn Hajar, what is Alhamd, or Qala so and so. And so you get an idea of which scholars that they go to for that opinion, right? And so for him, it was a Shaykh al-Akbar, Abdurrahman Jami. Yani it was just oscillating between those two people, because for him, as somebody in the subcontinent, they received a Shaykh al-Akbar largely through Abdurrahman Jami. So it plays out. But here, let me ask it in this way then. So, like, for example, yes, the hukama are Ibn Sina for the most part, in the sense that it's not really, but when they say it, that's often whom they're referring to. What about then, like the likes of Imam Ghazali? So Imam Ghazali is both a Sufi. He's definitely philosophically a Sufi. He definitely speaks about tahqiq. He's definitely someone that's been on the path. However, when he writes, particularly theologically, uh, is he at that time now writing with a specific hat in a specific language for a specific purpose? Because some of the ideas from some of the Ishraqi thinkers, and of course the Sharia, you touched on the Hukm Sharia, I was going to mention or ask that anyway, but that of course for Muslims, anything that conforms to the Sharia is perfectly good and valid, and anything that does not conform to the Sharia is rejected. It doesn't matter what it is, but if it's truly the Sharia and something does not correspond to it, and I don't want to talk about nafs al-amr in your presence, but from one perspective, let's say not so philosophical, the Prophet ﷺ is nafs al-amr, really. If you think about it, right? From that perspective, he's the true reflection, he's the ultimate mazhar of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And so it's that sharia that he brought. So whatever goes with it is accepted, whatever does not go with it is rejected. That's a simple way of looking at philosophy or anything for that matter, right? So when Imam Ghazali is writing, when he is very upset with Ibn Sina, when he is very angry with Ibn Sina, because we know very quickly after Imam Ghazali, the ulama didn't really speak about it. And Ibn Sina, although he is not their Imam per se, he appears. And he appears with a lot of reverence and a lot of respect. And so they may not necessarily be saying Quddisa sirruhu after his name the way that they would
Some
for
of
Al
them do,
Ghazali.
but yeah, not most of them. Yeah,
No, yes,
yeah.
some of them do. That's true. And definitely the Farangi Mahdi is, and again, my place here today is not to say what is or what isn't per se, but I can show, and I've shown people before that many of the Farangi Mahdis were very soft, not only soft on Ibn Sina, but they had deep reverence for him.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so, we can't deny that. So now, when somebody, how do they look at Imam al-Ghazali in this light? How do they view him?
MashaAllah. Well, when you said that Al-Haqiq al-Muhammadiyya is the Nafs al-Amr, I think we should just stop the podcast there. That's just the pinnacle. We can't get any higher than that.
Yeah.
MashaAllah. But there's an Iranian Fahras of Shaykh al-Mawaqif, in 4 volumes, I believe. Obviously they do most of the khidmah for these works, unfortunately, even the works of Ahl Sunnah. I hope that changes. But there are 11 pages of references for Imam al-Razi, Fakhruddin Razi. There are 8 pages of references for Ibn Sina, and there's 1 page of references for Imam al-Ghazali in Sharh al-Mawaqif, which is the most influential work of Ilm al-Kalam, advanced work of Ilm al-Kalam, really in the last 500 years. I don't think with any munaza, really. There are other very important ones like, the Tajreed and Hashiyat al-Tajreed and the Maqasid, but nothing quite on the level of the Mawaqif. So in terms of, the extent of the khidmah and the Hawashi and so on, well over 100 Hashiyas across the Ottoman and Mughal worlds. But so look, that is indicative of something. Imam al-Ghazali is a huge imam of spiritual realization. He's a huge imam in usul al-fiqh. He's a huge imam in fiqh. He's a huge imam in the aqliyat as well. There's no doubt about that. However, his main orientation towards kalam throughout his career is to say that it fails to be truly demonstrative. It's mostly just jadali. And what he seems to be putting forward in his Ihya Ulum ad-Din, which is obviously an unsurpassed work in its bab, is a form of holistic, synthetical demonstrativity, right? Which unfolds through a holistic method, which takes into account revelation, takes into account spiritual experience and purification, takes into account the aql, and so on. And he seems to be, and throughout the Ihya, he is importing all sorts of conceptual apparatuses from Raghib al-Isfahani, from Ibn Sina, and al-Hikmat al-Dhalat al-Mu'min. Anything that he, and as someone of a discernment of a level that we can scarcely imagine, he brings in things after they've been very, very carefully vetted, and he integrates them into a larger system. Now, people have made much of the 3 masail at the end of the Tahafut. And I as a humble worm, fully agree with Imam Ghazali on those issues, as his humble follower and hoping to be the dust under his feet. But you know, it's worth noticing that the conception that we tend to have inherited, that everything that Imam Ghazali says is the last word on everything always, is just not the way that the history of our Aqliyat unfolded. Dawani very, very much problematizes, with the hugest of reverence, Imam Dawani very much problematizes Imam al-Ghazali's account of Ibn Sina's position on the divine knowledge in his Sharh on the Adudiyya. And so he very much problematizes Imam al-Ghazali to the effect that it's not, it's no disrespect to Imam al-Ghazali, but it would seem that he did not have the resources available to him to fully understand Ibn Sina's position on the divine knowledge, which, as far as al-Dawani is concerned, fully affirms the detailed knowledge, Allah Ta'ala's detailed knowledge of the world. And so, and really the negation of knowing in a particular mode is simply a negation of having the particularized apparatuses which would entail that you exist in terms of a finite relation to another finite object. That's what's being negated, which is obviously a type of tanzih. It's there are others. Ibn Kamal, for example, great Imma, who have thought that Imam al-Ghazali's judgments in that section at the end are harsh and perhaps moderately hasty. I'm not saying as a worm that I have an opinion on this. I'm just telling you what exists in the literature, and what it should do is show us that pictures that we, let's say, inherit from fundamentally Orientalist narratives when we're trying to recover our identity. Where are we going to look? We're going to read this book in English and that book in English about the kind of overwhelming importance of the Tahafut al-Falasif and its place, just doesn't reflect its actual importance in our tradition. I'm not saying it's not a great book or a good book or a fantastic book, but is it like a book that they just can't stop mentioning, and the conversation has never moved on from it? It was the final word. That's simply not the case in any way. Now, Imam al-Ghazali, Ibn Rushd in the Tahafut al-Tahafut, and again, I firmly don't agree with Ibn Rushd here. I'm simply telling you what's there in the book, and what I think is really kind of besides the point. But he accuses Imam al-Ghazali of actually taking the positions of the philosophers as his real position, as evidenced by Mishkat al-Anwar, and the positions he takes there. Now, I can't dismiss Ibn Rushd as a thinker, because all you have to do is read Ibn Rushd rather than just straw manning him and saying he's bad because I think that I'm supposed to think that, because my mashayikh told me or something. If you actually read Ibn Rushd, you're talking about one of the most formidable minds in the history of mankind. That's what you're talking about. He is really scary. I'm not saying that he is, in terms of his polemical intent, he's correct and we should side with Ibn Rushd. However, I don't think one should dismiss one of the greatest experts on the history of philosophy and philosophy as a technical discipline, discerning that kind of influence. I don't think it's something we should dismiss too readily. Then the question becomes, well, look, if you're getting upset with me for saying that, I don't mean you, of course, Molan, I'm talking about, someone hypothetical who might be watching, then, why assume that what has to be involved in that is some sort of nifaq, hash al-imam, or some sort of, crypto Avicennism or something? That's not what we're saying at all. The imam would only integrate the positions of the philosophers if he was absolutely certain, as about as big an authority as you can get, that the ones that the positions he was integrating are completely in accordance with the Sharia as it was revealed are completely in accordance with our creed, specifically, as in the sense that they don't contradict the creed, and they constitute in whatever sense, whatever meaningful sense or relevant sense, rather, an interpretation or an elaboration of the creed and so on. And so there are many things which need to be rejected for certain. There's no doubt about that. But there are other things that it might be very possible to integrate. Now, Imam Ghazali in the Mishkat al-Anwar, for me, methodologically, and again, there are people who might get upset about this, but I think they need to just expand their horizons a little bit and realize that you can use a word and mean by it more than whatever happens to occur to you the first time you hear it, guys. I think Imam al-Ghazali, in a broad methodological sense, is clearly an Ishraqi philosopher in the Mishkat al-Anwar. Because what is an Ishraqi philosopher? Before you say, how could you say Ishraqi? And then I'm like, well, what do you think I mean by that? And you're like, well, I don't actually know. So why did you get upset then? An Ishraqi, what I'm talking about is for, the Ishraqi approach as a broad methodological choice, in the sense that ilm al-kalam is a broadly masha'i approach to knowledge acquisition. And again, la mashahata fil istilah. If you don't like me saying that, come up with a better word for it. But the point is, I'm saying it because the broad approach of the Mutakallimun and the Masha'iyah is that we're basically a tabula rasa, we're basically a blank slate, we don't have innate ideas, knowledge of the world is gained via abstraction from sensible particulars, we're immanentists in the sense that al-wujud yatawaqqafu ala ta'ayyun, there are no uninstantiated essences or Platonic forms or anything like that, and there's no serious role in spiritual purification in knowledge acquisition. There's not through tasfiyah that we gain this knowledge. It's not relying on kashf, but rather it's through applying the canons, the rules, in the sense of alat and qanuniyah, the logic. We're applying the principles of logic, let's just say, to that accumulated sense data, in order to, by subjecting it to the syllogistic process, deducing what it is that we can know about that which transcends the sensible. That's why I'm saying it's masha'i. And then the approach of Imam al-Ghazali in the Mishkat al-Anwar is broadly ishraqi, because what it prioritizes is purification of the soul. It also has a very important place for reason, but it's in terms of the data, as it were, it's not a very good word, but provided, the data of kashf, right? The data provided by that which is usually, in an adi sense, is resultant of the process of tasfiyah, and very much informed directly by revelation, in a very much a holistic manner, in the sense that, the results of the kashf match directly the results of what is revealed to us through revelation. Now, it's not the case that in kalam, obviously there's no credence placed to revelation. I mean, obviously, and this is actually very relevant. Although Imam al-Ghazali's critique of kalam throughout most of his career is that it's judly and doesn't reach the level of demonstrativity, when he speaks about ilm al-kalam in al-Mustasfa, it really seems not like I'm talking about a discipline that I have actually written in. It feels like he's saying, this is how ilm al-kalam should be. He says is, but it's as if he's saying should, because he says it's an ilm kulli, and he says its subject matter is al-mawjud bima huwa mawjud ala qanun al-Islam. Now, everyone, I mean, I won't ask the Shaykh, but I'll ask the audience, yani, what's al-mawjud bima huwa mawjud? Where does that originally come from? What is that? That's the subject matter of metaphysics, which appears in Ibn Sina, right? In English as being qua being, and goes back to Aristotle in his Metaphysics, where he says to on he on. There is a discipline which studies to on he on, which is al mawjud bima huwa mawjud, or being. It's really closer to being qua being, actually, rather than specifically al mawjud rather than al wujud. But anyway, that's another issue. So he seems to be prescribing a golden future for kalam, which actually hasn't yet transpired, right? And that's why when you then move on to definitions and the whole discussion about the demarcation of kalam at the beginning of the Great Summers, they say, standardly, it's al-ma'lum min haythu yata'allaq bihi ithbat al-aqaid ad-diniyya. Now, as is explicitly stated in the super commentaries, why is it al-ma'lum? Because someone new to al-kalam might say, oh, no, we're not going to accept al-mawjud bima huwa wujud because that's obviously falsafa. And, Imam Ghazali, al-ayn wal-ra's, but he was obviously a bit off there. Some things we can't take from it. But guys, al-ma'lum min haythu yata'allaq bihi ithbat al-aqaid ad-diniyya. That is al-mawjud bima huwa wujud, right? It's just that the specific reason may even amuse you. The reason they say ma'lum instead of mawjud is because they don't accept wujud dhihni. Otherwise, it's effectively, in terms of substance, an identical definition, right? And then, if you don't want the highest ilm shari'i to be subordinated to a non-shari'i higher science, you better affirm that ilm al-kalam is either al-mawjud in terms of subject matter or al-ma'lum. That's the only way. So it has to be that degree of that breadth of subject matter, that universality, I should say, of subject matter. I'll read a little thing from Dastur al-Ulama, this lovely, wonderful book that I just love so much. But he says in the book, it's a dictionary, a 4-volume dictionary of the sciences, right? And he says in the entry on al-masha'iyun, the peripatetics, okay? He says, التوصل إلى المطالب النظرية والمعارف الأصولية إما بطريق الفكر وهو مسلك المتكلمين والمشائيين, right? أو بالرياضة وهو طريق الصوفية, okay? والإشراقيين. مثل الفريقين كالأعمى والأصم والبصير والسميع هل يستويان مثلا؟ أفلا تذكرون؟ والطريق الأول, which might seem a bit down on kalam, so do forgive me. والطريق الأول لا اعتماد عليه لابتنائه على التخمين والقياس, ولذلك وقع في الاختلاف العظيم. وقال الشيخ شهاب الدين السهروردي رحمه الله تعالى, there's some poetry for him. He says, I love this. I just saw this today when I was thinking about our meeting today. وكم قلت للقوم أنتم على شفا حفرة من كتاب الشفاء فلما استهانوا بتوبيخنا فدعنا على ملة المصطفى صلى الله عليه وسلم. So the point is, this is, as I view, a broad philosophical approach, which I can call Ishraqi. It's not because I'm a follower of Saharaji, I believe everything he says is correct, or somehow it's like some weird occult thing other than the deen. For me, it's simply the philosophical methodology which allows you to fully submit to the revelation and to the Prophet ﷺ. And it's not that I don't, I was trained, there's a lot of negative language sometimes that people get upset about, understandably, because they don't come from traditions, with all due respect, so that they can interpret what's meant by the kalam. Okay, they might encounter words like that and they say, oh, it's so down on kalam. Kalam has been, done nasr of the deen all these years. How can you say that about kalam? Look, when we were, this is my Shaykh's view, okay? But he taught us ilm al-kalam for 10 years. Now, why did he bother? If it's just a question of dismissing it because it's not as good as kashf, why would he bother? It's a very, very important and beneficial tool. And the ultimate, and it's an absolute must study for every alim and will continue to be until the end, inshallah ta'ala. However, it's not where the buck stops in terms of the total fullness of knowledge acquisition. However, that higher stuff is a specialized ability. It can't be made the rule. For me, the ultimate defeater of the kind of, bifurcated, like you're either a rationalist like us, or you're one of those weird Sufis like them, and never the twain shall meet. The ultimate defeater of that miserable narrative is the fact, as is mentioned in the Shaqaq al-Na'maniyah, right, which is, as Maulana knows, is the Tashko Brizada's incredible book, which is the biographies of Ulama Ulama, one of the best books ever written. So he says of Mullah Fanari, not only did he, respectfully, but in terms of intellectual power, quite violently critique Taftazani in Misbah al-Uns, okay, for his what he considered to be, and I must, as a humble worm, agree with Maulana Mullah Fanari, what he interpreted as Maulana Taftazani radiallahu anhu's misinterpretation of the meaning of al-Wujud al-Mutlaq and al-Akbarian. Not only did he critique him in Misbah al-Uns very extensively, and I think very, very emphatically, and that doesn't really leave any room for much more niqash, Allahu alam. But he also is the main amil, he's the main agent of the integration of the works of Taftazani into the Ottoman curriculum, as it were, not that it was a formal curriculum, a fixed curriculum, and the Ottoman land establishment. And there's a story in Shaykh al-Na'mani, which is fully aware, by the way, of Mullah Fanari's, metaphysical Sufism leanings. There's a story that he stopped all of his students in his madrasa for a week from their durus so they could write out the works of Taftazani. So that was their understanding. Is there at the levels of knowledge that is not patronizing or putting down ilm al-kalam or anything like that. This is not what we were taught. We were taught the absolute utmost reverence. That's why I found it very funny when, certain things happened when I released my book, and some people got very upset from, particular backgrounds which, don't really have traditional lineages or a traditional scholarly environment that they come out of, which is very understandable why they would come to the conclusions that they do, who are trying to, because I'm critiquing some things in Ilm al-Kalam, mostly relying, of course, on our forebears and their works. They wanted to create a narrative that I somehow hate all of the mutakallimun and hate all of them as individuals, and I'm a kind of I'm just advocating this kind of esotericism, and it's a secret plot to undermine Ilm Kalam. And it was so ridiculous that I couldn't even be offended by it. I found it very humorous, because everyone who knows me, and those who accompanied me in the years of study with the Shaykh, know that we were instilled with all due respect, refuters of my work, with all due respect to you, with a level of reverence for Imam Taftazani that you can't possibly even imagine, in all honesty. But and for all of the great ulama of our tradition, the reverence that it was instilled in us for the ulama is something extraordinary that you can only experience, not to boast, you can only experience it if you have the great good fortune of coming into contact with the real scholarly lineage.
SubhanAllah, you mentioned Al-Allama Taftazani, and it's interesting because that story was in my mind. That I was going to highlight the fact that if you just look at the relationship of Taftazani throughout the Ottoman Empire, and that story of Mullah Fanari obviously is very important, because he gets his students to copy out all of his works. And so there's a type of tadawul of Taftazani's books that happen at the hand of basically an Akbarian. But also, if you think about just also, by the way, what you read out earlier, there's a wonderful passage by Ramadan Effendi in his Hashia on the Sharh al-Aqaid, which is that maybe a few more lines, and it's exactly that where he articulates it. And actually, one of my students, he actually took it, he translated it, and he put it out somewhere. So it's out there somewhere if someone wants to look it up, right? So what I always found fascinating was that in the Hashiyas on Taftazani, right, they will have these conversations and these debates and these discussions, and everyone is fully enjoying every other person's company spiritually. And all
Mm.
of them are in deep love and adab and reverence for each other.
Mm.
And it's happening in this remarkable way. And if I may, if you'd allow me just to give a couple of accounts, if you take someone like Fatih Sultan Ahmed, right, the great conqueror, Ni'mal Amir, radiyallahu anhu,
Mm.
but his forefathers are the ones that built the great madrasa of, um, I was going to say Konawi, but of Dawud al-Kisari, right?
Yeah.
Then they were Akbarian, they knew what they were doing. So this
Mm.
whole Akbarianism
Exactly.
or this exists. Yet it's Fatih Sultan Mehmed in his court that has the debate, that commissions Khajazada to write about the Tahafut. It's him that
Yeah.
wants to have this debate, and he's asking the question, so who was right? Was it Avicenna
Ex-
or was it Al-Ghazali, right? Now that's
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
coming, and yet this is the
And
same,
commissioning al-Durr al-Fakhr as well.
of course, and not just
Yeah.
that, but commissions through Mahmud Pasha, the Hashia of Khayali on the Shah al-Aqad. In
Mm.
fact, the commissioning Amir in the Hashia that he mentioned at the Muqaddimah is Mahmud Pasha, right? And so
Mm.
this is I'm quoting from Tashkir Prasad as well now, right? So the barakah of Tashkir Prasad is mawjood now, right?
Yeah.
And
Radiallahu anhu.
so radiallahu anhu,
He
so
had Ali al-Qushti in his court. You know, he was also a patron of Ali al-Qushti. Yeah.
of course, all of that, right?
Yeah.
So Tashkir Prasad mentions that when the head mudarris, the mudir of the Islamic madrasa passed away,
Mm.
so Sultan Mehmed says to him, "Who are we going to replace him with?" And he says, "I've got just the man, right? We're going to replace him with
Mm.
Mullah Khayali." Now, and
Mm.
he says, "Oh, the one that mentioned you in the Hashia." Right. So what people have to understand is that the Sultan was reading Taftazani, right?
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
the Sultan is commissioning Hashiyas on Taftazani, and they're all
Yeah.
Akbarian. And okay, well,
Exactly.
yes, I mean these are murids of. I mean, you can say Shams. He's a murid of Shams, but who's the Khalifa of Haji Bayrami Valley? These are the most esoteric Sufis that you're going to find, right? So I think what people have to understand, that's just, and then fast forward. I mean, even if you look at, I was going to get to it today at the end, but in fact, I'll save this for the end because I wanted to end on this about the role of Hidayat or Hikmah in some content in particular. And like, for example, Mayboudi or Mebzi or however you want to pronounce the word, that what they were doing. So I thought that would be a nice combination. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to hold that for now and just
Mm.
end with that. And we can have a little conversation about the role of Hidayat al-Hikmah, because I think what sometimes the point that you're making, I don't know why sometimes it can go a bit, um, I don't understand the need for so much anger, I think, from some people, in the sense that, you know, this tradition is not hidden. It's not like you can't just go and see it and read it for yourself. Like,
Mm.
so while teaching the Sharh al-Aqaid, for example, or studying it, you're going to have to resort to the Hawashi, obviously, and it's not hidden what they're saying. Even for example, Taftazani and his discussion on the Mujarradat, he doesn't deny them. You know, he doesn't deny Wijdan or Kashf or anything. He's speaking with a very particular hat at that time on. He's
Exactly.
speaking in a particular language, as was Imam al-Ghazali in the works that you mentioned. I think what people have to appreciate is that when they're speaking, understand them in their context. That there has to be a broader reading. And this is not saying that anyone's right or anyone's wrong. That's the point. The idea is that this tradition is hugely vast. It's beyond, I think, what most people appreciate of how vast it is. And it definitely is a tradition that does not like to pigeonhole you. It really is a tradition that likes people to think, likes people to reflect. If we did not have that, we would not have the Matalib of Razi. We would not have, as you mentioned, Jalaluddin and Dawani. I mean, these were pioneers of phases of I'm going to call it Kalam. Let's just say Kalam is intellectualism for now, just for a minute.
Yeah.
They were
Yeah.
pioneers in this field. They were
Oh,
they were people that were not shy away from their opinions, and they were not
mm.
shy away from critiquing other people and being critiqued. They were not shy from that, because ultimately, as you say, the objective was always al wasulu ila al haq. And so
Yeah.
for them, that was ultimately the journey. And again, as I mentioned, as long as things conform to the Sharia, the sacred Sharia of the Prophet ﷺ, there was no issue. Okay, with that in mind, I wanted to move on to ontology just a little bit. just a little bit. So, for example, you talked wonderfully about philosophy. I think what you did in your dialogue there was perhaps answer a lot of questions that people may have had and things like that.
Mm.
So we're
Yeah.
going to serve that as a great opening to the subject matter of philosophy. Now, of course, as you mentioned, you have natural philosophy, you have the tabi'iyat, you have siyasa, you know, you've got politics, you've got all of that stuff, ethics that can come into philosophy and historically have done. And perhaps in modern philosophy, those things have been all separated. But you, in terms of traditional philosophy, if someone's studying philosophy, medieval philosophy, Muslim philosophy today, or they're studying the Shar Mawaqif in any one of our madaris that may still teach it, really the objective is the Umur Amma. That's really what they're interested in. It's the study of being. So if you would allow just for a few moments to introduce the concept of Umur Amma, so that okay, we know what philosophy is. We know that some of it is not, philosophy as a concept is good in Islam, and you can have some things in there that don't conform to the Sharia, which you reject. But it's a love of wisdom, and our tradition is very broad, and it has these the sort of old Plato Aristotle sort of debate that fuses through these traditions with some added Sufism into there. So you've got that. But when I'm going to go and study a text, a classical text, really what I'm hit with is the study of Umur Amma. Yes, tabi'iyat are there, but let's take Hidayat al-Hikmah. You're going to begin with logic, you're going to move on to natural philosophy, and then you're going to come into, and all of this is a prerequisite for each other, because for me, what Al-Abhari is doing is the prerequisite for you to even get into philosophy is mantiq. You need to have the tools of the rationale, and then you need to understand the tabi'iyat and what a jawhar is, what an arad. You need to understand all of those things so that the metaphysics is going to make sense. Really, he's just getting you to the metaphysics. So what then is Umur Amma?
Well, the أمور عامة are ما يعرض للموجود بما هو موجود,
Mm,
right? They are the properties that يعرض is not easy to translate, but you could say they become ascribed to, or they are ascribable to, or they're the properties of, or they're accrue to, or but you know, it's better to just stick to Arabic in all honesty. ما يعرض للموجود بما هو موجود, right? Now, the idea of a specific exploration of the Umur Amma comes from, and this is really it seems very clearly to be the case, and in terms of historical linear influence, it seems to come from Ibn Sina's metaphysics, right? I do believe it's 1.5, where he says, ثم مفاهيم أولية لا
mm,
تحتاج إلى أن لا ثم مفاهيم أولية لا تحتاج إلى أن تجلب بأشياء أعرف منها, right?
mm,
There are أولي مفاهيم, primary concepts. I don't like any of these translations, but anyway, that do not need to, they're irreducible, okay? They do not need to be acquired in terms of concepts which are more basic than they are, because they are already the most basic possible concepts, right? So if you were to try to define existence, just to put it somewhat crudely, you would always be presupposing the meaning of existence in order to make your attempt, because it's an irreducible building block of knowledge. You can't get anything more basic than it. I mean, just to then that concept, just to give, you know, just to put it somewhat crudely, you know, any element that conceptual element that you'd be using in order to try to acquire that concept you'd already say that it exists, and so you'd already presuppose the concept of existence that you're trying to prove. So it would already be there. Now, there's a whole list of other concepts which are basic in that sense. I don't want to say properly basic and link it in anachronistically to quite a different philosophical series of philosophical frameworks, but there is some commensurability, of course. But you know, we would say badihi or self-evident. They cannot actually be defined because they would be presupposed in any possible definition. They're that basic. They are you might say they are entailed directly by our very cognitive apparatuses. They are the fundamental way that we seek to acquire knowledge. It's through those concepts. So there's nothing more basic than them. Yeah, this beautiful book, which has all this nice gold stuff on the front, but let's close our eyes and pretend we don't know anything empirically about it. But what can I tell about this book just if I know that it exists? And I'm not talking about the sense experience I'm having of the sharp edges, whatever. I'm talking about just that it exists. If it exists, right, it must also have an essence. Otherwise, it wouldn't be able to be distinct. If it exists, it must also be an individual, right? If it exists, it must also be a unity. But if it exists in relation to other things, it must also presuppose a multiplicity. So it's a multiplicity governed by unity. If it exists, it must be possible, because it wouldn't be here. And if it exists, it must stand in causal relations to other things as an effect or as a cause, or having some causal relation to the things that it interacts with, like my hand, for example. There is a certain relationality in terms of causal relations as cause or effect. And those are the basic umur amma anyway. So, why all this? You might think that this is very, very luxuriant ivory tower kind of indulgence. Why? It's because we need ilm al-kalam as the highest science to be a truly demonstrative universal science. And that means epistemologically, we have to get the starting point exactly right. And we have to know that in our epistemological and metaphysical foundations, we are building from certainty to certainty to certainty. And so that's the basic reason why this this became integrated into Ilm Kalam standardly after Imam Razi. Now, not that there weren't bits and bobs before Razi, but it became standardly integrated, as has been decisively shown. So basically, what is less well known is that and this is extraordinary, and it's sad that we haven't yet explored this as much as we should, because it's extremely significant. What has also been shown by Jan Etzen, and then was echoed later by Heidrun Eichner, I'm not sure if that's how you say her name, is that it's exactly the same passage from Ibn Sina's Metaphysics that I told you earlier, that I recited earlier, the Thamma Mafahima Awaliya thing, that forms the inspiration and basis for the whole medieval Christian study of the transcendentals, right? And if you read Jan Etzen's books on the transcendentals, I think that his major work is called Medieval Philosophy as Transcendental Thought, where he sees the study of the transcendentals, which is essentially a different list of the Umur Amma with the same broad purpose. He sees that as what is most fundamental and characteristic about medieval Christian philosophy. It comes from exactly the same source, and the whole rationale behind it is as well serving as a demonstrative foundation for a true demonstrative metaphysics. So it's a slightly different list in the Christian world. Some are the same, being and unity, for example, are the same, but then they have truth and beauty as some of their transcendentals, for example. But it comes from exactly the same passage. You'll see that in Jan Etzen's book, and you'll see it also in Heidrun Eichner's famous postdoc habilitation thing, whatever it is. Oh no, it's not postdoc, it's habilitation. That's the kind of next level doctorate that the Germans have. So in any case, yeah, I got a little bit. From your original question, I think.
No, that was perfect. It's a beautiful synopsis of what the Umur Amma are and then why they're there. And so that's wonderful. And as you say, it's like Imam Razi placing it, in fact, just before he begins his discussions on Kalam. He's telling you a story just by where he placed the section. And I think what's wonderful as well is I think as like any tradition, the development. People sometimes think, because we hear this a lot, that but this is the khalaf. You're talking about the khalaf, and if you're talking about a synthesis of different turuq, in terms of whatever, it's khalaf. It's not that it's not. But what people have to appreciate is that it's not that if they took something away from the salaf, there's a problem. But if they not just redefined, but they refined, they codified, they strengthened. I mean, didn't we see that in fiqh? I mean, we saw that in fiqh, you know. So it doesn't take anything away from the ai Like, they famously, they say that a Shafi'i is the one imam that, is grateful for Nawawi. Normally all the imams are grateful of them, but because Nawawi is so important, right? And likewise, like, can you do away with Al Ghazali for fiqh in the Shafi'i madhab? No, you can't. You know,
Yeah.
Without him, you don't have the minhaj. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that the khalaf is not a problem in and of itself. It's not like it is in and of itself be dhatihi a problem. They've developed and progressed in that way of making things watertight, airtight, like definitions. They made definitions more watertight, etc., etc. So that was wonderful. I think one last bit before we move on to epistemology, and I've taken a lot of your time. And there was a few things on epistemology, and then some concluding remarks that I would want from you, some questions that I had. But just to finish off this point, because I don't think we could have you in a conversation and not talk about Wahdat al-Wujud. So even though we're not talking about Umar Amma, but in terms of being, um, and again, forgive me if I'm saying this in a problematic way, um, and please feel free to reframe it in a way that's correct or more appropriate. But we do see today a lot of sort of Western thinkers that are articulating a type of non-dualism, for example, and they are arguing that it's not pantheism. So a claim or an argument that's made against the likes of Shaykh al-Akbar and other sort of Akbarian or Sufi, whatever thinkers, is that essentially it's pantheism. That's really what you mean. God is in everything, right? Which is deeply problematic to make that statement. So they'll say that statement. And you've got these sort of non-dualist Western thinkers that will come out and say, well, there's no pantheism here because the pantheism is ultimately when you're, well, from one perspective, I don't even think people appreciate what pantheism is. But I think what somebody may think that what they mean is that God is somehow hulul, he's hal in creation. Whereas they would argue that, but you're affirming a reality for creation that we don't affirm aslan, right? And so now the problem, not the problem, but what happens with Sufism or spiritual traditions is that the terminology is their own. So they will use their own terms and they will speak on their own terms. That I think creates a lot of confusion. Because let's say if you're used to kalam language or you're used to legal language or philosophical language, and then somebody comes and talks about ta'ayyunat or shu'un, or they talk about madahir, or whatever it may be, or there's no haqiqah for other than God. La wujuda illallah, right? Or illahu, right? This parlance of the Sufis can maybe throw people off sometimes. So if somebody was to say, well, okay, I want to know what Wahdatul Wujud is. I'm Muslim. I don't like the idea of pantheism, of course. I feel very real, you know. And in modern culture today, there's all this thing about, with like games like Minecraft and things like that. It's all like we're in some kind of virtual reality or the Matrix or whatever. It's very common, right? So when the Sufis said Wahdatul Wujud, what did they mean? Where does it move away or overlap with some modern non-dualist ideas, or even traditional, like Buddhism or things like that? Where does it diverge from that? How would you explain that in that way?
Jazakumullah khairan. Well, it's a very, very important question. This system of thought, again, the language always seems to be insufficient because it's not really a system of thought, but let's just call it a system of thought. This system of thought of Wahdat al-Wujud, it has been very, very influential in Islamic intellectual history. And it keeps on popping up again and again and again in different milieus and different historical epochs, and illuminating some and causing a lot of discomfort and anger for others. But I think it's also worth mentioning that there have been epochs where there's been very, very wide acceptance of the thought of Shaykh al-Akbar. Again, it's not the right word, but there you are. Let's not get stuck on the words. And it hasn't really been problematized very much at all, and that's because the mafahim have been very, very clear. I find that the school of al-Shaykh al-Akbar, especially the philosophical school, is enormously clear in its negation of any imputation of pantheism or somehow that Waḥd al-Wujud states an identity between Allah Ta'ala in his transcendence and God. Allah Ta'ala in his transcendence and the world in its particularity. And so, but the reality is, Al-Shaykh al-Akbar himself is enormously clear, not in 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, or 10, or even 50 places, but in hundreds of places. And I really struggle, just like I don't understand the jur'ah of moderns who come along without a traditional background, who rewrite history about what the tradition was and what the scope for normativity and acceptability was historically when the evidence is overwhelming. I also don't understand the jur'ah of those who selectively read from the Futuhat, just like you don't, well, obviously it's a much more elevated level of the hadith and the sacred hadith, but just like you can't selectively, you can't become fixated on a particular hadith, the meaning of which is clarified in numerous other places. That's just completely unacceptable. Someone would simply point out, well, your fixation on that hadith to the exclusion of all of the clarifying context and the other hadith which make clear what it means is simply lacks scholarly scruple and has no scholarly value. The Shaykh al-Akbar is explicitly clear on many, many occasions that he is not identifying the world with Allah Ta'ala. It's true that there is some muhim language, right, at particular contexts, which is meant to be understood in a very specific way. Now, let me get there. When we come to the school of al-Shaykh al-Akbar, people say, well, oh, I'm so worried because it says there's only one wujud and Waḥd al-Wujud, and what about all of us, and what about creation? And, you're saying that everything's God. Again, it's bewildering to me. Go and look up al-Siwa in any dictionary of Akbarian thought, again, not the right word, or, go and look for what is al-Siwa. I mean, you can even do it very simply. Just put it in quotation marks, Ayuhal generation, whatever you are now, Z, or not, I almost said millennials, but that shows what a throwback I am, because I'm a millennial myself. Put it into Google and say, search for the definition of al-Siwa, right? Put al-Siwa huwa, right? And then put the name of your whatever your school of Shaykh al-Akbar book is of choice is. The point I'm trying to make is not that you're actually going to do that, because my instructions haven't been enormously clear. The point is the definition is very, very clear. You'll find it all over the place. Al-Siwa in the Akbarian system of thought is al-muta'ayyin min haythu huwa muta'ayyin. The siwa is al-muta'ayyin min haythu huwa muta'ayyin. Allah Ta'ala is not his ta'ayyunat. He doesn't enter into them. In fact, the meaning of other than God is specifically the particular thing in its particularity. That's what other than God means on their understanding. Okay, then you might say, well, you're saying there's only one existence, and surely that thing exists. No, Habibi, la mushahata fil istilah. They are not saying that particularity min haythu a particular exists. That's the whole point. It doesn't, in their specific terminology about existence, it's not called existence. Okay. Now, that's why, one of the great shurrah of al-Salat al-Akbariyah says the difference with the Ash'ari on this so-called issue is a khilaf lafzi, because he says we both agree that the finite I'm putting words in his mouth a little bit, but this is the meaning. The finite created existence of the world, okay, is posterior to, is after, is dependent upon, is contingent upon, is other than the existence of God. But he says the difference is the Sharia call that wujud, and we don't. But the meaning is it's other than, it's distinct from the existence of God. It is after, it presupposes, and it's contingent upon. So all exactly the same meanings. And that's exactly what the Akbarian is saying. To understand this, yeah, go ahead, Mola.
Sorry, Philly, just if you don't mind. So on that, I think also where there can be some confusion is the idea of not just, okay, it's term wujud, as opposed to, let's say, ta'ayyun, but it's also wujud min al-adam. The idea of, because the Ash'ari are very, very specific in al-wujud min al-adam. So if you don't mind, just ever so slightly entering in from that door to carry on from where you
Oh,
where,
yeah,
where
I'd
you were
love
going.
to. That's my favorite door. So so when you talk about al-ayana thabita, Maulana, Shaykh al-Akbar says in Salat al-Faydiyya that they're ma shammat ra'ihat al-wujud, right? They don't possess existence as things. They're thabita, right? They possess a type of thabut because they're distinct in themselves. There's no reason for that not to be commensurate with, or even in some sense, in terms of its formulation, influenced by Mu'tazili syllogism, right? Which says, kul ma'dum mutamayiz wa kul mutamayiz thabit, right? Because what they have to be thabit because they are mutamayiz, okay? If they are not, something can only be mutamayiz if it's actually there, right? Otherwise, it's just a figment of one's imagination. So, so there's nothing wrong with that. If it's true, then there might be a particular application of it which is wrong. But actually, the argument from Tameez is almost exactly the same as the argument from Wujud al-Dhihni, which, according to Galambui, most of the later Muhaqqiqin accept, okay, which is نتعقل ما لا ثبوت له في الخارج إذ نحكم على الممتنعات إيجابا ونجد من المفاهيم كلية ومن القضايا حقيقية ويمتنع الإضافة إلى العدم الصرف. If there's no distinction, you can't have an إضافة to that object of knowledge, therefore it has to be there. Therefore, Wujud al-Dhihni. So it's exactly the same argument. So the point is that the Ariana Thabita have a type, they're distinct, but they don't exist. All that shows is that it's a particular mustalah. Allah Ta'ala alone has true existence, real existence, okay? Now, when it comes to the sense that it's al-wujud min al-adam, it's exactly the same in the Akbarian tradition. What do you mean by wujud? That's the question, everyone. What do you mean by wujud? That's when people start scratching their heads. It's like asking a physicalist, what do you mean by physical? You ask an immanentist, neo-Kalam person, what do you mean by wujud? And they're like, oh, hold on, I'll get back to you. What do you mean by wujud? How does it differ? Because as Imam Sha'rani says, al-Yawaqit wal-Jawahir, he says, one question that is raised, and he's quoting the Futuhat, one question which is raised by the fact that the Ariana Thabita, all mutamayas, timelessly in the divine knowledge. Allah Ta'ala Hasha doesn't need to acquire them or wait for a future moment or wait to, as it were, obviously temporal language is not appropriate, but wait to create the world in order to then know them later. That would entail something completely unacceptable to ascribe to Allah Ta'ala, which is any imperfection, any shortfall in perfect knowledge, any falling away from, falling short of perfect knowledge. But he says, if it all already exists there, what did it gain by coming into existence? Okay, because then now we're getting ambiguous about the word existence. But let's say if it's already thabit there, as in it's already mutamayyiz, what did it gain from coming into existence? It's already there, right? So what does existence mean? And he says, existence means it being granted, it being dressed in self-knowledge, as in it's woken up, just to use poetic language. It gains knowledge of itself. Whereas Ayana Thabita, nothing is conscious there. There's only Allah Ta'ala and his knowledge. But the Ayana Thabita are not individual beings in that state, right? Who that know themselves and so on. That's what happens in the first martaba. In the Akbarian understanding, the first martaba of creation is the world of alam arwah. Now the thing is, the average neophyte Kalam person who's read 2 lines of Sanusi and now thinks he's Shaykh al-Islam is going to say, oh, that's not what our Mashayikh taught us. Habibi, this is just basic Islamic theology. Allah Ta'ala has timeless knowledge of the world. Yes, before it is created. His knowledge of the world is not of the world temporally in its particularized instantiation. Our ulama are very, very clear about that. Okay. For Allah Ta'ala to purpose to create something, it can't already be there, right? So unless he already knows about the thing he purposes to create, okay, his creation of it would depend on it's already being there, created. But it's not. That's the whole point, that he has the free choice to create it. He knows all of the possibilia, and he creates the possibilia that he wishes to create, and the ones that he doesn't wish to create, he doesn't create. They stay possibilia, just to put it crudely. So that distinctness has to obtain in al-azal for Allah Ta'ala, right? For him to be able to purpose to create the world, okay? His knowledge of the world is not the knowledge of the world after the fact, because then who purposed to create it or not to create it, right? The ulama are very clear about that, a very, very clear nusus throughout our theological tradition. To claim otherwise, as some extreme factions have done, is to actually ascribe jahl wa hasha lillah, kada wa kada. I didn't want to say it. So, and so it's complete kufr. So, and it also happens to be William of Ockham's position, by the way. And it's amazing how many of those neo-Kalam people who are desperate just to, be these kind of Ockhamists, basically have have this kind of extreme parsimony when it comes to the Kalam, as if somehow this makes them authentic. How they end up just agreeing with Ockham on every single point, which is just an irony. But nothing's entailed by it. It's just historical fact. Go and look at Ockham's positions. They're all exactly the same as extreme neo-Kalam people. So the divine knowledge as a fact is not, it's somehow in competition with extramental existence. These are two different things. So my point is, the divine knowledge is not of the extramental temporal existent. The divine knowledge is azali, and it pertains to something which is does not depend upon the fact of creation, but rather constitutes the prior conditions for creation to emerge, right? As in terms of the divine will in his timeless knowledge of all possibilia. And so there's no fundamental difference there with the Akbarian view. All the Akbarian view says is, all that it does is give a much more satisfying answer as to why there are objects of knowledge in the first place. Okay. Again, the neophyte answer, though it's a sifa kashifa, and you obviously don't know what you're talking about. No, you don't know what you're talking about, Habib. With all humility and all due respect, saying that the divine knowledge is a sifa kashifa does absolutely nothing whatsoever to help you in this mas'ala, which is the question of why are there azali objects of knowledge in the first place? If the creation of the particular world out of the possibilia rests on an act of divine will, why are there objects of knowledge in the first place? Right? The Akbari mashrab can answer the question, which is that those objects of knowledge are images of the divine names, right? Those objects of knowledge are images of the divine names, and they are there as madahir of the divine nature, and they are there because Allah Ta'ala has infinite knowledge in the perfection and the plenitude of his being, including every possible, just to use loose language, mirror within which every possible perspective, every possible imitation, every possible determination by which to know his own names, his own nature, right? And that's why, and again, you'll find very standardly in the Kalam tradition, the divine knowledge is iqtida kamal dhat. The divine knowledge also, God's knowledge of the world is a consequence of his knowledge of his own essence. That's something you'll find, again, very standardly in the Kalam tradition. But it's also a very characteristically Akbarian understanding, right? But it's just that the Akbarian understanding is worked out in terms of a very particular framework, which informs an experiential world, which generation after generation of Sufis have partaken in degrees of proximity or distance. I'm not saying everyone is Imam Ghazali or Shaykh al-Akbar or Imam al-Rafari or someone has like total kashf of everything that is possible for us to know about the unseen world. But certainly, I think this is one of the saddest things that has been taken away from us is that, I mean, it's historically unquestionable that the majority of Muslims in Islamic history have been connected in one way or another to Sufi turuq. And the nafahat, the barakat, even if it's, as I say, you're not, we don't happen to be Imam Rafari or Shaykh al-Qadir Jilani, that we have a certain nasib experientially from these realities, from the reality of the Haqiqa Muhammadiyah, from the reality of Alam al-Arwah, from the reality of Alam Mithal. This is where Muslims lived and breathed and had their being in Islamic societies, even if they were on the atraf. And so, yeah, go ahead, Rolena.
I was going to say, well, this is where the soul wandered, right? So this is what we were hoping that we were going to get to. As you mentioned, that everybody benefited. The idea of this is where the soul wandered, which is the point of the discussion.
Precisely. This is where the soul wandered, Ahbabi, and this is where we have to look at our context in the contemporary world, where again we have this factionalism where we want to identify as a specific type of Muslim, and that's because we've been divorced from what Ahmed Bulkila. I have to give credit where it's due because he's the one who came up with this term, a beautiful term. He came up with so many beautiful terms. What Ahmed Paul Keeler would call our holistic environment as Muslims. We've become we've become divorced from our original holistic environment. So, let's say we have a tech job, we work in STEM, whatever, we're a STEM person. We have some sort of very, very kind of very quantitative, very technical tech job or something, and we study ilm al-kalam on the side. And other than that, we're kind of cooped up like a battery chicken in our apartment. And then we go out to, I don't know, let's pretend we're in England. We pop out to Sainsbury's from time to time, and we go into the center of town and whatever. And then we come back home, and we go back to our online world where we are identifying as this particular kind of Muslim. And then we've got our Kalam lessons where we're really a Kalam person. I identify as someone who doesn't believe in all that mystical mumbo jumbo. I'm just, rational and stuff. And then, you go to your tech job in the morning. That's not your holistic environment. So you are creating an artificial reality which does not reflect the spirit of Islamic civilization at all, because what would actually be much closer to the reality is someone comes out of their dars in Taftazani, or let's say in Morocco, Maulana al-Yusi, or whoever it happens to be, and they would then walk through the old city of Fez or whatever, let's just say, and they'd stop at this maqam and do a fatah and receive a field from there. They go stop at this maqam and do another one. They'd pop in the qaruin and pray their dhuhr. And then, they go on with their durus throughout the day. And then at night, they go to their Darqawi Zawiya and do a hadra. And then there'd be a dars on haqa'iq. Okay, that was their reality. Okay, it wasn't your fragmented reality of identitarianism. I'm going to identify as this type of Islam. This is all that Islam is, and this is what it really is. And, yeah, it fits in that understanding of Islam as a rationalism, as a kind of anachronistic 18th century French Enlightenment rationalism, is because it's not a rational ism at all. It's rational, but it's not a rational ism. That's exclusionary. Fits in very well with your tech job, actually, guys. it fits in very well with your very narrow instrumental view of existence. All we need to thrive as Muslims is tech jobs, and to be an engineer, and then to have some proofs for the existence of God tacked on. And I think that's just a fundamental, it might do the job therapeutically for you, but it can fundamentally misreads the nature of modernity. And that means when it's confronted by a more integral, fundamental critique of, let's say, traditional knowledge systems from this perspective of modernity, it will collapse like a house of cards.
Mm. I think that it's interesting you mentioned that. It's a bit like, you can be one of the greatest academics of the Islamic tradition, and I'm not talking about ilm, I'm talking about ma'lumat here, right? So great academic, excellent writer, whatever, but they don't pray salah, you know, like they don't. There's, I mean, Orientalists, some of them are brilliant scholars of
Oh,
Islamic intellectual
some of them.
history.
Yeah.
They're really good, and they're very thorough, but they're not even Muslim. And I think
They
that's
don't believe
probably,
Salah. They don't believe in the Prophet ﷺ. Yeah,
I think,
exactly.
so. I think that's the example that you're making. And I mean, this is a great point. I think you answered the question before I asked it, and maybe that's from your cash, right? Because the penultimate question was going to be, about, well, how do I trust any other's cash? But let's say this entire system, but you answered it very beautifully and eloquently just now. I don't know, but like this idea that, okay, so tahqiq. Okay, so what you're basically telling me is that the road to that ultimate knowledge, as much that you can, that ability to realize that you are a reflecting being, right? And that for you to have self-reflection, which is ultimately something very perhaps unspeakable, right? But that is really what you're about. And that really, to know that ilmul yaqeen, or that haqqul yaqeen rather, it comes through dhawq, it comes through an experience. I don't have that experience. But you're telling me that the Shaykh al-Akbar has that experience, that all of the Sufiya, Safiya, that they have these experiences. Now, what I like, by the way, just a small jumla mu'tarida here, is that I love what Fazl-e-Haq Khairabadi mentions in a Rawd al-Majud. He says that is for the uqul uliya. And he says they are the truth, right? And he says there's ijma of theirs on it. But we're going to speak at the level of the uqul mutawassita. That even if I don't, because even if I haven't had the tahqiq that they had, I trust them and the ijma. And it's interesting. I gave this argument to somebody. I said that, we trust ijma. It's really important for us, right? The tawatur, the concept of tawatur, so important, integral for our epistemology in terms of revelation. I said, but what about the tawatur of the karamat of all of these awliya? And then all of those awliya that said the same sort of thing. Isn't that
Exactly.
also interesting as well? Okay, so that's a rational argument for why the Sufiya are correct. However, somebody could say, but especially in a deeply skeptical world, a world without hierarchy that you argue for in your book, a world where if it doesn't make sense to me, I don't get it. If I can't observe it in that very sort of reductionist way of looking at one's own existence, right? If that is my reality, how do I trust the kashf of these other people? Because you're expecting me to understand. Now, somebody could turn around and say, but you don't have to. Like all of the nuances and details and subtleties of their cosmology, of their ontology, of what they're explaining about at the beginning of creation and all of that, you don't have to. Pray your prayers, be good to
Oh
your
yeah,
parents.
exactly.
And
Yeah.
so maybe it's not for you, but let's say somebody says, I want to know it. I want to know it. I don't have the strength to put the work in and the riyadha and to have those mukashifat myself. So why should I trust a Shaykh al-Akbar? Why should I trust these other people? I mean, maybe there's no answer for this that is satisfying. It isn't for you to answer it, which is you don't have to and carry on with your life. But if you were to say something to somebody like that, what would you say?
I'd say Abdussalam Mashish isn't a follower of Shaykh al-Akbar, but he says, Allahumma salli ala man minhum shaqat al-asrar wa انفلقت الأنوار وفيه ارتقات الحقائق وتنزلت علوم سيدنا آدم فعجز الخلائق وله تضاءلت الفهوم فلم يدرك منا سابق ولا لاحق فرياض الملكوت بزهر جماله مونقة وحياض الجبروت في فيض أنواره متدفقة ولا شيء إلا وهو به منوط إذ لولا الواسطة لذهب كما قيل المقصود صراط تليق بك منك إليه كما هو أهله اللهم إنه سرك الجامع الدال عليك وحجابك الأعظم القائم لك بين يديك. اللهم الحقني بنسبه وحققني بحسبه وعرفني إياه معرفة الإسلام بها من أهل الجهل. Anyway, and on it goes. رضي الله عنه. Um, so, he's not a follower of Shaykh al-Akbar. Why is it that the awliya are all saying the same thing? Why Imam al-Rafai, who's well before, he says, I'm just trying to remember him in his Madad al-Mustarshid, he says, نبيك الآخر وحبيب منتخب جوهرة خزانة قدراتك وعروش ممالك حضراتك هامات مشاركة برماتك ورسالتك إمام الأنبياء وخاتم المرسلين مقدم أمراء ملجأ العاجزين قاعد في محل الشاهد مدار فلك الأحسان والكنز الخفي الذي بعرفناك فكفى به برهان عيني عين علمك المكنون ببحر سر معنى نون ودقيقة أمرك المسون بدقيقة إشارة كن فيكون واسطة الكل في مقام الجمع ووسيلة الجميع في تجلي الفرق رحمة للعالمين قبل العالمين وإمام الأنبياء والمرسلين قبل أن يخلق آدم من الطين آدم من الطين أقرب خلقك وأجل عبادك وأحسن عبادك وأجمل عبادك سرك الباهر الذي جعلته كعبة لأهل الأرض والسماء ونورك الظاهر الذي لأجله علمت آدم الأسماء.
Allah.
والنورك الظاهر, that's Imam al-Rafai رضي الله عنه. You have Ibrahim Haki Bursawi saying قد اتفق أهل الظاهر والشهود على أن الله تعالى خلق جميع الأشياء من نور محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم. So didn't you controversy? So, why are these people all saying the same thing? People think from our modernist perspective that Shaykh al-Akbar, what I read on the Stanford Encyclopedia article, it's all absolutely outrageous from my perspective. But that's not what Shaykh al-Akbar is. He didn't come up with these things. Yeah, he is the Shaykh al-Akbar, certainly, Sultan al-Arifin. He has, he's the Kabrit al-Ahmar. I mean, his aql is like the Shams. I mean, he does things that just a level of tahqiq that's never been seen before. But he didn't come up with the Ayan al-Thabit or the Haqiqa al-Muhammadiyya or Alam al-Mithal or any of this stuff. This is an experience reality for all of the Arifun. And that's why he's accepted by them. So, I would suggest Husn Dhan for these people because, people tend to be frightened of what they can't understand. So, don't put yourself in the danger of niqmah just because you can't understand what you're reading, I would say to people. And I would also say, also, there are certain assumptions. I mean, this is Sharh al-Mawaqif, for example, and we all know about Sayyid Sharif al-Jurjani's status and history as an Akbarian, which again has been problematized by people who are outside of the tradition, has never been problematized by anyone inside the tradition. What does he say about tasfiyah as a source of knowledge, as in kashf, as a source of knowledge? Why is it not accepted in kalam? He says, he doesn't say it's not accepted in kalam because it's just completely arbitrary and subjective. He says, لِإِحْتِيَاجِهَا إِلَى مُجَاهَدَاتٍ قَلَّمَا, right? لِإِحْتِيَاجِهَا إِلَى مُجَاهَدَاتٍ قَلَّمَا يَفِي بِهَا مِزَاجٍ. He doesn't say because it's not in principle possible, because he says it depends upon mujahadat قَلَّمَا يَفِي بِهَا mazaj, right? It's very rare to find that anyone has the capability to achieve this kind of knowledge. It's not a rejection of that kind of knowledge. It's just that the prerequisites are too difficult for most people and most capacities and most dispositions. And so it can't be considered, as you said, for the aql, the aqul al-mutawassita, it can't be considered a public form of knowledge. And then, Abdul Hakim Sayalakuti says something, Radiallahu anhu says something very interesting. Sorry, just give me a few seconds to find it. So he says, al-tawajjuh at-tam, in terms of mujahadat towards spiritual realities, which is mustatbi' lil-ilham istitba'an adiyan, right? So there is this understanding that al-ilham is a legitimate form of knowledge. It's just not a public form of knowledge which can be ascribed to ordinary human capacities. That doesn't negate that it's being a source of knowledge for specialized capacities. It just negates it being a source of knowledge for al-uqul al-mutawassita, what can be mudawan as a public science, okay?
Mm.
This is very clear in all of these works. It's very clear. Just
Yes.
read a little bit further. Yes, in Sharh al-Aqaid, it's negated as a source of knowledge, but just read a little bit further. Read a little bit further the Hawash, you'll realize they're not negating the reality of that
Mm.
form of knowledge. They're
Mm.
not negating it's a source of knowledge mutlaqan. They're negating that it's a source of knowledge in a very specific public context.
Mm.
And have Abdul Hakim al-Saylakud, he says something very, very interesting here. He says, al-wijdan, okay, which mostly means sense experience. It can also mean inward experience, like I'm in pain, but it can also more broadly mean any form of experience. He says, al-wijdan لا يقطع باشتراكه فإنه لا يكون حجة على الغير إلا بعد إثبات الاشتراك. Okay?
Mm.
So the point is, if I go to the maqam of Shaykh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani and I say, when I went to the maqam of Shaykh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, I've never been, unfortunately, but let's just say, if someone reported to me, I went to the maqam of Shaykh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani and I experienced this extraordinary field of barakat, which took over my whole being. I actually kind of more or less passed out from my immediate environment. And then I experienced a haqiqah. Let's say I experienced that al-haqiqah al-Muhammadiyah. I felt like I had a vision of it because of the power of that place. And you meet someone and they say, although I experienced it slightly differently, I had exactly the same transport experience when I went to the tomb of Shaykh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani. I was taken out of my normal consciousness. This has never happened to me before. And it was as if I was shown a haqiqah. Okay. Now, what is the epistemological status of that claim if you just put it in a public work on paper? It's worth absolutely zilch in and of itself because there's no way to justify it rationally. There's no way to deduce it. There's no way to relate it to sense experience. There's no way. But if a Sufi gets his hands on that book who's had a similar experience, he says, yes, that's exactly the same experience I had. That's why it's actually not so different to a guidebook to Australia. Okay, that someone so this is all about these lovely places, Australia, wasn't it? That particular neighborhood is really lovely. And I've never been to Australia, but someone who reads that, so I read it and like, yeah, okay. But to about Australia does actually exist, but this means it could be lies. I have know nothing directly about this. And the difference in that and someone who has been to Australia, has been to that street, has been to that neighborhood, has eaten in that restaurant, they're like, oh yeah, that's a real place, that's a real thing. That's why experientially, as opposed to deductively in terms of reason, in terms of possible experiences, Kashfi knowledge is just as valuable as sense knowledge. Okay, that's why when al-Shaykh al-Akbar talks about al-aql min haythu qabil wal-aql min haythu mutafakkir, okay, he actually says al-aqul min haythu hiya mutafakkira, or yeah, I think that's it. So what he's saying is discursive knowledge, which is linear knowledge in a straight line, every A is B and every B is C, so every A is C, that can't give you knowledge of very much, really. It's not useless, it's incredibly useful, but it depends on the madda that you put into it. What are you talking about? What are you applying that formal structure to? The madda in the logical sense, obviously, not in the ontological sense. What madda are you applying that logical form to? Because it's not itself giving you very much. Bidalil modern logic, which they've completely stripped of matter, and it doesn't get them anywhere. It doesn't give any knowledge except of the formal relations themselves. So the point is, I can have Kashfi experience, and then as it were, I plug it into the computational process of the formal structures of logic, and then I can reason about it. I can start to understand more about it by relating different aspects of the experience. That's why Mullah Fanari is able to say, ithbat of the muthal, okay, rationally leads to the ithbat of al-wujud al-mutlaq and ultimately wahdat al-wujud and so on, right? That's why you're able to have a work like Misbah al-Uns Bain al-Ma'qul wal-Mashhud, okay, because there is this interspace between these different domains, which is the aql. The aql in itself is, as it were, neutral. I hate to say that about anything, but it's as it were neutral. It depends on its madda. So if it takes madda from kashf, then it reasons about the kashf. If it takes its madda from the senses, then it reasons about the senses. But it can't on its own get you to an experience. I can't reason really hard about Australia and then experience it. It's not going to happen. Okay, I'm like, no, I'm going to get Australia by reasoning about it. That's the armchair rationalist. It's not going to work. You're never going to get to Australia. But I can, in the sense of experientially, but I can fly to Australia and go to the outback, and I'll experience it, and I can, experience whatever corner of the world it is, and I can also undergo the requisite training and have these Wahbi experiences. Now, is Kasbi, I would say purification is a necessary but not sufficient condition, okay? And even calling it for mystical unveiling, and even calling it I would say to Samohan that you'd say it's a necessary condition. It's necessary under ordinary circumstances, but the reality is, with the case of the majdhub, it can just be given without any mujahadat whatsoever. But usually, it's speaking in a loose context, it's a necessary but not sufficient condition, in the sense that someone can undergo all sorts of mujahadat and they don't get the kashf experiences. And also, one thing which is mentioned in our Kalam works, which is why we cannot rely on kushufat when it comes to a demonstrative theology like Ilm al-Kalam, is because the Jews and the Christians and the Hindus and whoever it happens to be, they also have spiritual experiences which are resultant of their mujahadat, and they strain to believe that those experiences are somehow supporting their batil aqidah. That's why we have to have an intellectual holism, an epistemological holism, which takes from all of these sources, where they're regulated ultimately by the aql. And when it comes to giving an overall picture of the nature of reality, there is absolutely nothing that can hold a candle to the revelation of Islam, because it has all of these dimensions. It in and of itself is suggestive of an epistemological holism when it talks about, for example, سنريهم آياتنا في الآفاق وفي أنفسهم حتى يتبين لهم أنه الحق. You've got everything there. You've got the experiential dimension. You've got discursivity because you're moving حتى يتبين لهم. And it's في أنفسهم, so it's also about Wijdani knowledge. But it also has that kind of dialectical dimension to it as well. But Maulana, you very kindly let me just waffle on, but I feel that I'm just
It was wonderful, and I think it brings us very nicely to that final question, which we intending to teach the Hidayat al-Hikmah, for example, at the madrasa, but it was important to perhaps outline why a text like that's important and how it should be used. Now, I don't want to get into the whole debate about, well, how's a student of Razi writing a book in, peripatetic philosophy? And, oh no, it was just to showcase it's like the Maqasid al-Falasifa. And if you look at the commentaries, I'm not about to get into that conversation. That's not what this is about. But what is interesting is the matan does find itself cherished within the, let's say, the Farangi Mahal tradition, and the type of commentaries that it attracts, and the hashiyas in those commentaries are really what interests me more than anything else. because a lot of what you were saying today, particularly about the ilm of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Abdul Haq al-Abadi on his commentary, the Hidayat al-Hikmah, speaks about that at great length,
Yeah.
about what that means. In fact, he says that it's, exactly as you say, a misunderstanding of the position of not only Avicenna, but others in that broader tradition, or in the way that they speak about it. So there's this, even if they don't, the commentators don't necessarily affirm Ayula or something. I'm not going into that. But what I found is Mebzi or Mebudi, I found it to be the most interesting because Mebzi is explicit in his intention, but he's using it really as a springboard in going into all of those directions. I did this once. I was in a different article. No, I don't think I showed it, but I
Mm.
showed Nizamuddin, Mullah Nizamuddin's Hashia on Mullah Jalal on Dawani. Unfortunately, the manuscript's not complete. So all you've got is a makhtut and it's not complete. And I just showed, for the purpose of exercise, how Mullah Nizam, this is arguably the founding father of Damson Nizami. There's argument that it was his. But on one page, he quotes Imam Ghazali, Imam al-Razi, Avicenna, Shaykh al-Akbar, Suhrawardi, uh, Imam al-Ashari, Imam al-Turidi, and even has time to put in Plato and Aristotle, right? And that was on one mas'ala that he says this and he says that and he says this and he says that. And then in the end, he gives his own position. And in that moment, his position, if I remember correctly, coincided with the Shaykh al-Akbar. But the point was is that this is what they were doing in their Hawashi. They were having a great time.
Mm.
They were basking in all of the wonderful aspects of the Islamic epistemological tradition, and they were drawing upon all of that with not just great vigor, but with great confidence. And so, one of the reasons that we want to do with Hidayat al-Hikmah is to do that, which is it's not just about teaching necessarily, particularly metaphysics, just about teaching it as dogma. Either dogma that this is Avicenna or no. But here's an idea, okay?
Mm.
And how from this idea can we look at what these different schools mentioned, different ways of approaching it and why they approached it? Only in the idea. So I thought, who better to have than yourself? And we've spoken about Hidayat al-Hikmah in the past, but what was the role, do you think, of Hidayat al-Hikmah historically anyway, generally speaking? And what do you think that the ulama were doing when they were writing these commentaries and these hawashi on a book like that? Why do you think they chose a book like that? For example, why would the Farangi Mahallis, who are Maturidis in terms of some kind of identification because they're Hanafis, they're definitely Akbarian, and that's again demonstrable. They are Sufis, they are all of those things.
Mm.
Why would they choose Hidayat al-Hikmah? They had their own books, like they had other books that they could have used. Why would they choose Hidayat al-Hikmah, do you think?
Well, the ulama were not interested in straw manning anyone, and they were also aware of the build-up of the sciences in terms of what is the original reasoning involved in how doctrines develop, even in a polemical context. What is the origin of a particular problematic, within a polemical context? And they were very, very aware that every philosophical position, because of their correspondence theory of truth. And the thing is, very often today we inherit a constructionist theory of truth, right? Where we somehow believe. That's why we get so upset when like Aristotle or Kala Plato or something. We get upset by that because we think, well, what are they doing here? I don't want to hear about them. But, I've got my Islamic hat on today, and I don't want these non-Muslim names to be here, because we believe that knowledge is constructive. We believe it deep in our hearts. We don't believe that Plato discovered the tripartite soul, right? Of القوة الشهوانية القوة الغضبانية العقل, right? He discovered that because it is one is جلب المنافع, one is دفع المضرة, right? And it's completely integrated into the القوة الغضبية, sorry. It's completely integrated into the Islamic tradition. You find it in al-Baydawi's tafsir. You know, someone might come along and say, oh gosh, that shouldn't be there in Baydawi's tafsir. It's like this is talking about the Quran, and I've just realized it's from Plato. Because they weren't looking at it in that way. They're saying it may well be a specific philosophical figure who uncovers some truth for the first time, but that's the whole point. It's uncovering. He uncovered something that everyone else can then come along later and say, ah, yeah, Yani, this is true. It's evidentially true, right? It's clearly a fundamental and true way of looking at reality. They don't say, oh, well, it's associated with Plato, therefore it must be bad. Because actually, the fact that he may or may not have been the first person to discover it is just by the by. It's just not very relevant at all. So the point is, I think even today, when some people teach the Hidayat al-Hikmah, they think it's only for polemical purposes, but it's not. It's very clearly not, because those same themes in terms of the mawdu', the way that we look at the sciences, you know, it's al-mawjud min haythu huwa mawjud, or it's al-ma'lum min haythu yata'allaq ithbat al-aqaid ad-diniyya, or it's al-mawjud min haythu huwa mutaharrik, if it's physics, or as well. You know, these are legitimate epistemological modes which are of interest for their own sake for the ulama. So they want to follow the reasoning. You know, look, Hidayat al-Hikmah is a work of peripatetic philosophy. It's basically the school of Ibn Sina. Okay, that's why I've got several commentaries on it in this box, but I won't try to find them right now. But the point is, you know, someone like Maulana al-Maybadi, he, you know, is very clearly, and it's very well known about him from his broader, you know, in terms of his broader biography and his broader interest, that he is, broadly speaking, an Akbarian thinker. He's of the Akbarian mashrab, of an Ishraqi mashrab. And that's why on the very last page of his commentary on Hidayat al-Hikmah, he says that this, he implies, you know, almost completely explicitly, but not quite explicitly, that this level of philosophy is just the first rung on the ladder. After that, you need to look at the works of Ibn Sina, then al-Shaykh al-Maqtul, and then beyond that Tawr, there is a Tawr which is that of al-Kabrit al-Ahmar. I mean, he's not, that's the only place where he's not quite explicit, but it's very obvious to anyone who reads it that he's talking about al-Shaykh al-Akbar. So, you know, they read these works not out of purely polemical intent. We need to, the legal aspect of everything is deeply important, but we can't be legalists. We can't reduce everything to is it halal or haram? And then, you know, if it seems a bit dubious and okay, you're claiming it's halal for some sort of, for the greater good or something, then, you know, oh gosh, I'm still very nervous about it. That's not the only consideration. It's an important consideration, but it's not the only consideration. The ulama were interested in investigating haqa'iq al-ashya, and the main interest in reading these works were the degree to which the knowledge of these works, the reasoning involved, is beneficial to that ultimate end. But also they were very scrupulous in that, because they were polemical as well. They were very scrupulous in their polemical activity. They didn't straw man people. They wanted, this is really the you know, what we call the hukamat, but it's really Avicennan philosophy when we look at it from a historical perspective. And you know, this is giving you the keys to explore that whole way of thinking. And it's not because it is perfect in itself, or it is, you know, ideal, and it is, you know, exactly what we're after scientifically in the sense of ilm, in terms of a manzuma of the ulum, which is serving revelation. There's something, you know, a lot went fundamentally wrong with the approach of the philosopher, and they're very aware of that. I think that, you think that, Mullah Shams, you know, we're not hiding anything. You know, I think that Avicenna, a lot of his philosophy is, you know, dead wrong and very dangerous. And it serves as a sign for all of us until the end of time of how, you know, not getting your mabadi' right in terms of your relationship to revelation can go very, very wrong if you rely too heavily on your limitary conception of the aql. But I just don't want people to think that the purpose of this study and our interest, our, curiosity, intellectual curiosity as Muslims, always has to be in this legalistic, paranoid framework. That's not Islam. Islam is a deen of al-hikmah al-dhalat al-mu'min, and it's a deen of the unity of truth because likulli ummatir rasul. So we should expect to find bits of the truth everywhere that we can recognize. And when it comes to the role of Ibn Sina, you remember what I said about 8 pages for Ibn Sina in the Fahras of Shaykh al-Mawaqif and 11 for Fakhr al-Razi. He was important. He was al-Shaykh al-Ra'is. You can say that without saying that he's not highly problematic elsewhere. He is. But when it comes to logic, when it comes to what later became known as Umur Amma, and is already known as Umur Amma in his context, but slightly different in his works, Umur Amma. And when it comes to his psychology, all these things, he has benefited. The ulama who came after him have drawn on his works very extensively and benefited from his discussions. And they, when they say he's a Shaykh al-Ra'is, they mean he's a Shaykh al-Ra'is in his particular fields. He's, a true imam in what you'd call general metaphysics and in logic, but he goes wrong with what you would call his special metaphysics. His account of the eternity of the world is unacceptable. His account of the resurrection of the body is unacceptable. There are various aspects of his philosophy which are unacceptable and should not be accepted by Muslims, and that's quite right and correct.
I mean, it's like the whole Imam Aflatun, they knew what they were saying, or just the interactions with Tusi by like the likes of Giorgiani or Ali Kushchi. And I mean, when we first had the good fortune of spending a bit of time with some of the Hawashi, the commentaries on Tusi, on the Tajreed, you didn't find them angry or shouting and swearing, or even in Bab al-Imama, it was just, okay, this is his evidence, yeah, these are our evidences, and so why did you write on Tajrid? The question was, you're Giorgiani, right? You're Ali Kushchi, why are you even writing, or you're Asfahani, why are you writing even on Tusi? It's because you recognize his merit. And I think that's the point that you're trying to make here, that doesn't, Tusi is a Shi'i. It doesn't suddenly make me a Shi'i to recognize. It's like someone saying Nietzsche was a great philosopher. That's true.
Mm-hmm.
That's true. Like Descartes and all of these people, they shaped the entire modern world. For better or for worse, that's not the point. They shaped the world. And I think that's the point, that, and why I say that is because, forgive me for going a little bit political here, I feel always, as a post 9/11 sort of war on terror, traumatized generation of Muslims, particularly in the West, we were always in survival mode. It was, our favorite books were like 100 answers for why Islam is not bad, sort of thing, right? And I think a sign of creativity, sorry, a sign of confidence, or a sign of people not being in survival mode but actually comfortable and thinking, is when that creativity comes alive, because they've got the opportunity to do it. And so I think when you look at the ulama, obviously they had there was great patrons of their works. And if you look at most of them, how is it Shaykh al-Islam Abu Sa'ud Effendi wrote such an amazing tafsir? It's because Suleiman Qadri was funding it. How does Mullah Khayali be Mullah Khayali? It's because he had people like Fatih Sultan Mehmed and his father Mahmud before him funding. So it's so I think a sign of creativity for Muslims is when they get out of the identity politics and they just engage with that whole tradition in a beautiful way. And I think you made some really important points today on that, which is the idea is not that you necessarily have to agree with everything that everyone says, but you could be broadly, you're in your Islamic intellectual. We're talking about Sunni tradition here. We're talking about a Sunni tradition here that's based upon Quran, Sunnah, Ijma', Qiyas, based upon the hadith of the Prophet, etc. But some of these articulators were they were immense in their articulations, and they naturally were charismatic, and they impacted people because of the truth. And I think when people resonate with that truth, it was for a reason. And so I think it's been wonderful. Today, I think it's been fantastic. I think there's some things that we had to leave, particularly on about a sort of revival of. But I think, inshallah, I hope and pray that you'll give me time again. I think what would be amazing to have is a part two with you, because I think what would be excellent, and I really wanted to get there today, would be to see what are the ways that you believe that you can reinstate, because I've been doing this a lot because we're in the mode of curriculum building. And so I'm constantly trying to interview people about how do we reinstate a metaphysic that permeates. I mean, I'm in the land of, say, Naqib al-Attas. He's had a big role to play in trying to do that. So what I think we're going to leave that for a part two. So we'll leave this on a cliffhanger, inshallah, for the listener. That hopefully we can have you back to talk about what are the steps. What would you do first? What sort of books would you use? Would you even use books? Maybe you'd use poetry. Maybe you say just bring back the poetry and the molids, right? What would it be to create once again that environment, that Fez environment, like you say, where even one of my favorite things about Fez is just hearing them, smacking the plates. When they're I don't know what the official English word is for that, but when they're making those bowls and those plates, there's something so therapeutic in that old city of that sound. Just to create those environments where people can feel, where they can feel like they are truly self-contemplating and God-contemplating beings. I think that would be an amazing, amazing discussion. But anyway, Jazakumullah khair. Thank you very much for
Yeah,
your
I'm
for
absolutely
your for your
delighted
time.
for the opportunity. It's lovely to see you again and be in
Uh,
your presence. So thank you so much.
Inshallah, and you. And I'm gonna ask you at the end to just make a short prayer and Fatiha. But thank you for everybody that listened to this, and please make dua for Shaykh Hasan, that Allah Taala makes easy all of his affairs, protects him for the
Ameen.
ummah, and grants him a long life filled with iman, ihsan, and afiyah and salama. Allahumma ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. Sayyidi, if you don't mind ending with a short dua and a Fatiha.
Yeah. اللهم إنا نسألك إسلاما صحيحا يصحبه الاستسلام لأوامرك ونواهيك، وإيمانا
Amen.
خالصا راسخا ثابتا محفوظا من جميع الشبه والمهالك، وإحسانا يزج بنا في حضرات الغيوب ونتطهر به من أنواع الغفلات وسائر العيوب، بإيقان يكشف لنا عن حضرة الأسماء والصفات ويرحل بنا إلى مشاهدة أنوار تجليات الذات، وعلما نافعا نفقه به كيف نتأدب معك ونناجيك في الصلوات، واملأ قلوبنا بأنوار معرفتك حتى نشهد قيوميتك السارية في جميع المخلوقات، واجعلنا من أهل دائرة الفضل المحبوبين لديك ومن الراسخين المتمكنين في التوكل وصدق الاعتماد عليك، وحقق رجاءنا بالإجابة يا كريم يا وهاب في كل ما سألناك، ولا تكلنا يا مولانا في جميع حركاتنا وسكناتنا إلى أحد سواك، فإنك عودتنا إحسانك من قبل سؤالنا ونحن في بطون الأمهات، وربيتنا بلطيف ربوبيتك تربية تقصر عن إدراكها العقول المنورات، فنسألك اللهم بنبيك الذي فضلته على سائر الأنبياء والمرسلين، وبرسولك الذي جعلت رسالته عامة ورحمة للخلاق أجمعين، أن تصلي وتسلم عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه صلاة وسلام ننال بهما محبته ومتابعته في الأقوال والأفعال والمراقبة المشاهدة والآداب والأخلاق والأحوال، ونسألك يا مولانا بجاه أن تهب لنا علما نافعا ينتفع به كل سامع، وتخشع له القلوب وتقشعر منه الجلود وتجري له المدامع، إنك أنت القادر المريد العالم الحي الواسع. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون، وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. اللهم صل وسلم بأنواع كمالاتك في جميع تجلياتك على سيدنا مولانا محمد أول الأنوار الفائضة من بحور عظمة الذات المتحقق في عالم البطون والظهور بمعاني الأسماء والصفات، فهو أول حامد ومتعبد بأنواع العبادات والقربات، والممد في عالم الأرواح والأشباح لجميع الموجودات، وعلى آله وأصحابه صلاة تكشف لنا النقاب عن وجهه الكريم في المراء واليقظات، وتعرفنا بك وبه في جميع المراتب والحضارات، والطف بنا يا مولانا بجاهه في الحركات والسكنات واللحظات والخطرات، والطف بنا يا مولانا بجاهه في الحركات والسكنات واللحظات والخطرات، والطف بنا يا مولانا بجاهه في الحركات والسكنات واللحظات والخطرات. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. Thank you so much, Mailan. Jazakallah khair.
Barakallah fikum, Sayyidi. Allah yajzikum al khair. I'm just going to stop the recording from it. Again, to everyone that listened, barakallah fikum, jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.